you, Mr. Chairman. I represent a largely suburban district, very professional, upper middle class, and I would say to you the largest reason why these professionals have to seek assistance with their tax return is the alternative minimum tax. The largest deduction most of my constituents have are their property taxes and their house payment. So I don't think we can have any meaningful discussion about simplifying the tax code without having a discussion about the AMT, especially in my district. Mr. Viard, is that how you say it? Is there a way to calculate the amount of money that is gained by virtue of the alternative minimum tax? Is there a baseline where you can say, if there were no alternative minimum tax, here's the amount of money was collected, but because we're collecting the alternative minimum tax on top of it, it represents what percentage of the total tax collected?
It is certainly possible to compute that number, Congressman, and in fact the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, which is probably the most authoritative source of data about the AMT and about many other tax topics, has computed that. I don't have that number with me offhand, but one interesting fact is that we have reached a point where it is actually cheaper to repeal the regular income tax than to repeal the AMT. Now, the bulk of the revenue that's being collected each year would be raised under either of these tax systems, and only a modest portion is the increment that arises from having two of the systems as opposed to one. But nevertheless, at this point, in that particular sense of the term, the AMT has become the bigger tax system, quote unquote.
Are you familiar with? Is there a largest deduction across the nation for AMT payers? The single largest deduction that they lose, what deduction do they lose first?
They lose the state and local tax deduction in its entirety, so it's the property taxes, as you mentioned, and also either the income or the sales tax, which itemizers have a choice to deduct. They also lose their personal exemptions, and that's kind of an interesting fact because Professor Ballin mentioned we don't normally think of the personal exemption as being a tax expenditure. We think of it as being part of the normal tax system, and yet it is not part of the alternative minimum tax. The AMT treats the per-person exemptions of $3,700 for the taxpayer and the spouse and the dependents as if it were a tax preference, and eliminates that under the AMT.
And so they would lose that. Is that the most common thing that they lose?
Those two are the biggest single items.
And Mr. Johansson, I found your report to be especially good because when you go to your specific examples of dealing annually with the AMT, I think that is the most, that hits most of the families in my district. They plan all year long on, they think they're planning all year long on what tax they may owe, and then most times they have paid in my district, most times they have paid in too much. And so they are getting big checks back, but they are curtailing their spending during the year because the government's keeping more of the money than they actually need, but they're doing it out of precaution. And it's my contention that if that money was available in the economy to be spent, that we would have an acceleration in the economy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Rangel's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome all of you. Thank you for sharing your views with us today. During the President Reagan